Welcome to the Provocateurs podcast, enabling you to think differently about leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Provocateurs podcast, where we explore the experiences, insights, and perspectives of inspiring leaders. Our aim is to provoke you to think and act differently through conversations with some incredible people. I'm Dearlove, co-founder of Thinkers 50, and this is a collaboration between Thinkers 50 and Deloitte. My co-host today is Steve Goldbach. Steve leads Deloitte's sustainability practice in the US. He is also the author, along with Jeff Tuff, of two best-selling books, Detonate, which came out in 2018, and Provoke, which inspired this podcast series. And the final book in the trilogy, Hone, is forthcoming and will be with us and available in September this year, 2025. Steve, it's great to see you.
Des, it's great to see you too. And I'm really excited to be back on the podcast. And I'm super excited to have Eileen Collins join us today. Eileen is one of those inspirational people that you hope to meet once in your lifetime. She is a retired astronaut from NASA and a former Air Force colonel. And in 1995, she became the first woman to pilot a space shuttle, flying the Discovery to the Russian Mir station. In 1999, she became the first woman to command a space shuttle mission. The STS-90 was launched with the Chandra X-ray Observatory payload, the newest space telescope since the Hubble. It would go on to capture X-rays not previously seen in deep space images, capturing astonishing images and new data. Eileen's final mission in 2005 was commanding the return to flight mission, the first since the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. Eileen is the author, together with Jonathan Ward, of the 2021 book, Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, the story of the first American to command a space mission. She is also the subject of a landmark documentary film, Spacewoman, which premiered in November 2024. And where can they find the documentary, Eileen?
Well, the documentary is not available yet to the general public. We're hoping by the end of 2025, it'll be out there. So I'll be posting it or eventually get a platform so everyone can see it.
That's amazing, and we hope that it gets picked up. And if we were to list the awards and honors that Eileen has received, it would literally take up this entire show. But I would just note that she was recognized by the Encyclopedia Britannica as one of 300 women who have changed the world. Eileen, welcome. It is great to have you. It was great to get to hear you speak earlier this year at our Chief Sustainability Officer Summit in Westlake, Texas. Des, she was amazing. And so maybe, Eileen, a place to start now that we're all acquainted with your amazing background is just, what's your backstory? How did you arrive at this moment with all these honors? How did a little girl from outside of, Elmira, New York, grow up dreaming of being a pilot and then an astronaut?
Well, thanks. First of all, Des and Steve, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm happy to share with you and your audience the things that have worked for me and actually things that have not worked for me. To answer your question, I think it was really having a passion for something. And for me, that passion was flying. I had this burning desire in me. Honestly, I don't know where it came from, but I just wanted to fly. And it might have been a sense of freedom. Maybe, as much as I love the little town that I grew up in, I love the people there. I have this explorer gene in me where I always felt like I had to get out and do something new and different, to find something new and different, to really understand the world that we live in. And I think that's kind of a big general description. The outlet for me that I saw that was something that I actually could do was to fly airplanes. I had to raise the money myself. When I was 16, I started getting part-time jobs. They were all really whatever I could get. I worked in a hospital. I worked in a pizza restaurant. I worked at my church. I worked at my school. Any money that I could make, I worked at a golf course, but any money that I could make, I saved for flying lessons. And by the time I was 20 years old, I had enough money to get a license. And that was when things really started taking off. But to answer your question, I think it really is having a passion in maybe seeing something in the world that is missing, that you think that you maybe have the ability to go out and fill that. And there weren't many women pilots back in 1978 when I first went into the U.S. Air Force. So, I think that all came together.
But it can't have been an easy journey. I mean, you make it sound as though it's all sort of very matter of fact. And I mean, even saying it's one thing to be a woman pilot, but to be an astronaut. I mean, what do you think propelled your ambition and made you think that you could, break through and do this?
Well, there were a couple of specific things to answer that. My hometown, Elmira, New York, is also the location of the National Soaring Museum, gliders. There's a glider field called Harris Hill, which is right across from the National Soaring Museum. And when I was a kid, my mom sent me to summer camp up there, not to fly, that was too expensive, but we just had a regular summer camp that was nearby. And I'd watch these gliders flying overhead, and I would always, what would it be like to be in one of those? And my dad would take us to the airport. It was cheap entertainment. For your listeners, if they have kids, you don't have to spend a lot of money on your kids. You can do cheap stuff like we did. We'd sit on the hood of the car and at the airport, and we'd watch planes take off and land. That was fascinating to me. So I started reading books. Now, my mom took us to the library. That was just something to do. It was free. Back in those days, she just dropped us off and went and did her thing, and us kids would run around the library. And I found books. Books were my door to the world outside of my hometown. Of course, as a kid, I read, you can name it. I read books on horses, dogs, bugs. Nature was always interesting. But when I found the section on flying airplanes, I started checking out books and reading them. And there were so many. Fate is the Hunter is one that I'm thinking about. God is my co-pilot. There was a book called The Stars at Noon, which is about Jackie Cochran, who started the Women Air Force Service Pilots in World War II. And in that book, I went, oh, look at all those women pilots. Maybe I could do that someday. I think that we need to encourage our kids to read books more. Today, they're all on their phone and, they're looking at what their friends are doing and living, I want to say, not a full life. And I think if you really want to live a full life, find books on great people that did great things. And I think Jackie Cochran was one of those people who, she came from nothing and she worked her way up in the world. And she started this amazing organization for women pilots that really helped in World War II. And she became like a role model for me. And I think that really answers your question. I think very specifically, reading books. I also read books about military pilots. Now, there were no women military pilots back in, obviously, World War II that actually fought in combat. But the men were still my role models. And I loved reading about their interesting adventures. And of course, wars are horrible. Nobody wants to go to war. But it was really the flying part that captured my imagination. The airplanes, the way you fly an airplane, and the kind of people that they were. And I think that's really what made me decide to apply to be an Air Force pilot.
So speaking of the people and the culture of flying, I think oftentimes the public who doesn't have the insight into what one of these missions takes often hears that it was a successful mission and they assume that everything just goes to plan and goes easy. But I'm sure that in any of these missions that we all perceive on the ground as perfectly successful, there's lots of technical challenges in flight, and that's got to be both, you're in space, so that's nothing simple, I guess it's safe to say, in space. So how are these kinds of challenges resolved in space, and does it take a special kind of culture to be able to address these challenges, and how do you create that? So I'd be curious if you could just tell a few stories in that vein.
Yeah, a couple of questions there. Those are really interesting, great questions. I think my first answer is the training and the practice. We have what we would call a training team. They were a set of instructors. They each had an area where they were really an expert in a specific system on the space shuttle, and nowadays the space station, not just how that system works, but how it fails. So the way you really learn about a system, now in system, I'm talking about like the space shuttle main engines, the space shuttle propulsion, on-orbit propulsion, maybe the hydraulics, the electrical, the computers. How do all those systems work? How do they operate normally? But you really learn about a system when you learn how it fails. And so we would work with our training team and by the way, as we got more advanced, we worked with mission control. which were different people. They were still engineers, but they were the ones that actually worked in mission control during an actual flight. And our training team would work with us really for a much longer period of time and helping us understand the system. And we would simulate segments of a mission, whether it was launch, entry after the mission, some on-orbit phase like rendezvous, and we would fail systems. Maybe the auxiliary power unit failed, maybe engine number 2 failed, maybe a set of maneuvering jets failed. And we had to immediately make a decision as to how we're going to complete the segment of the mission. And when that's over, how do we bring back the systems that failed? All of that we learned through study and training. And I would say, sometimes study is really kind of hard to motivate yourself to get started. But the way we did that was we would kind of compete with each other. And if you were the one when the malfunction hit, if you were the one that knew the answer, like, good on you. So those kind of things would really motivate us. So I would say practicing, and whether it's choreographing or in our case, setting up simulations, that really motivated us to study. And then it motivated us to do well when the actual, I want to say, training period was taking place. And then you hoped it never happened in orbit. My first, my third, and my fourth mission had some pretty challenging failures on them. I talk about that in my books. I won't go into any detail now, but I really want to answer your question. It's in preparation. And let's say, for example, so one of the things I do today is I'm a speaker. Even if it's a speech I've given before, I do it out loud 3 times the day before I'm scheduled for the speech. It doesn't matter how often I've done it. I still need to practice. The other thing, okay, so I'm going to switch to your second question, which is on developing a culture, because you could talk forever about a culture. And I would say the culture in the astronaut side of the space shuttle, because I think we really had different cultures, but the culture on the astronaut side was really one of being the best you can possibly be. And that has to do with the type of people that we hired, people that you get along with. And we know we're all fascinated with, like, you can watch these space shows on TV where, maybe the astronauts don't get along with each other, or there's some kind of human interest story going on over there. Well, in general, those things don't happen. In general, the crew works together. We help each other out. If somebody's getting behind on something in one segment of the mission, somebody will, hey, can I help you, get ahead on your schedule? Can I do some other task for you? And in training, we try to help each other out. And I think that has to do, first of all, with the type of people that we hire, but secondly, with the type of leadership that we have. The crew commander, as well as, I would say, your training team lead, your flight director, are all people that want the mission to succeed. And we like to compete as far as what we know, but we don't like to compete as far as anything that would hurt the mission, if you know what I mean. So I think that's just a very brief description of the type of culture. I want to say that, and I don't want to get too far ahead because you'll probably ask me later about leadership. It's what I call humility. And that is really not being quiet and shy. I don't think humility is not being quiet and shy. Humility is a willingness to listen and to share and to help other people around you do their best.
We are going to ask you about leadership. Of course, we're going to ask you about leadership. Not every day we get somebody who's led a space mission on the show. We've had some great people, but you are unique. So we are going to ask you about that. But just to stick with with some of the technical problems, and without wanting to spoil the book, because people, I'm sure, will want to read all the things in the book. But on your 1999 mission, so that was STS-93, the initial launch was halted half a second before the engines were due to fire up due to a faulty sensor, which was giving the indication that there was a fuel leak. You're sitting on top of this machine, and half a second before you're supposed to fire up the engines, which presumably the engines would have all had to be replaced. I mean, it's a huge thing, and you're down to the last half second. One thing I want to ask is how, 2 parts to this question too. How do you cope with that sort of stress and danger in such a matter-of-fact way? But the other thing I find amazing, I think people listening to the show will find amazing, is for you to talk about being a speaker. I mean, I know I've heard you talk about when you went to the Clinton White House and you had a panic attack. You're going to meet the president. I mean, for goodness sake, the thing you're doing when you're sitting on the spacecraft on the launch pad and you're cool and calm, and yet you're about to meet the president, and you suddenly have a moment. And I was very taken by what you said, is that you had to sort of become the shuttle commander. You kind of almost switched personas, separated yourself from being Eileen and became the shuttle commander in order to meet the president. Talk us through some of that.
That is very, very true. And it's amazing what the little techniques you come up with when you're faced with a situation like that. Now, to the first part of your question is about on my third mission when we had the launch countdown taking place. And my answer to that is you're on the rocket and you're watching the clock count down and you're inside of 10, 9, 8, 7, and then the clock stops. And it was bouncing back and forth, 8, 9, 8, 9, 8, 9, the clock. And then I'm looking at it, and I had never seen that before in training. Well, here we are just like a split second from engines starting. And my thought was, you have to be ready to either launch or to scrub. You have to be ready for both of them. That is what comes through training and through thinking through these scenarios before they actually happen to you. Of course, you have to think through thousands of scenarios, and most of them never happen. So this one happened, and I think my first thought is, what do I have control over and what do I not have control over? I do not have control over the launch countdown clock. I can stop it, but I can't restart it. As commander, I can stop the clock. That's another question. There are times when you would, as commander, have to stop the clock. But I heard the word cutoff on the radio that was coming from the Launch Control Center. So I knew that there was something bad that happened. I have to be ready at that point. Well, we're not going to launch, but I have to be ready to get out as quickly as possible. So I'm not worried about me. There's no emotions except possibly my heart is beating faster. And I'm thinking. We might have to do what's called a mode 1, which is where the crew has to unbuckle and run out as fast as we can. And we take a slide wire. It's like a zip line that you would take from the launch pad down to the bunker. If there is a hydrogen leak or even an oxygen leak, which is flammable, and I'll just leave it at that. You could have a bad situation. We train for that. So I'm sitting, I'm listening, I'm ready to do an immediate mode 1. I'm listening. I told my crew, we're going to be okay. The other thing is you don't want your crew to panic. So I hey, crew, we're going to be okay. We've seen situations like this before. Everybody listen to the radio. Let's get ready to, I don't want to say the words mode 1 because people might start leaving. I said, we want to get ready to get out in case they call. And so these are all the things, I'm running these things through my head. We also had that particular launch. We had 2 serious malfunctions. We ended up launching 3 days later. We had 2 serious malfunctions going uphill. We had a hydrogen leak out of one of our engines, and we had a electrical short in one of our AC buses. And the crew had minimal work to do on those, but we really were thinking we have to be ready for the next failure. So it's all training. Now, you mentioned the White House. Before I flew that mission, and I had been named as a shuttle commander, I got word that the White House wanted to announce the first woman space shuttle commander from the White House. And Bill Clinton was the president at the time. And prepare a few remarks. So prepared a few remarks and headed up there. I thought it was okay. Brought my family with me, and we went in. We met the president. That was fine. The moment of panic was when we left the Oval Office. I looked across the room, and there's this room called the Roosevelt Room, and that's where normally the president will make announcements. It's quite a small room, but I saw a bank of cameras along the wall. I saw some famous reporters that I recognized. Sally Ride was sitting in the front row, and it was the first time I met her, by the way. And all these famous people were in there. And I looked in the door. I just kind of snuck a little peek in the door. And that's when I had what I would call a panic moment. And I had never panicked, like physically panicked in an airplane. There's only 2 times in my life that I think I panicked. The first time I was 13 years old and I was almost in a fight. That's a whole other story. And this was the second time. I felt sweat start at the top of my head, and the sweat went down to the bottom of my feet. And I turned to my husband and I said, I'm not going in there. I'm done. I'm not doing this. Because he tried to talk me out of it. I knew I had to go in there and make my little speech. I started thinking, just go in there and be the woman commander. You're not Eileen anymore. Just go in there and be the woman commander. Be what people expect you to be. It's only going to take 10 minutes and it's going to be over. And so I went on, I did it. It was over. I went back to work. and I was happy after I went back to work because I'm a pilot. I'm an operational person, at least back in those days, not very good on camera. I had not trained for that, except maybe a very small amount of training, but I was not prepared for that. What is the lesson to be learned? You have to be prepared. I really think if I had practiced and trained for walking in a group of people that were putting their cameras on me, if I had trained for that, I think I would have been better at it. And that's really the answer. I could go on and on, but that's really the answer to the question. Prepare, train, understand what you're afraid of. Everybody's afraid of something. I'm trying to think of a good example. Understand what you're afraid of. I don't like bugs, for example. I used to read books on bugs so I could learn more about them when I was a kid. If you really understand what it is that you're afraid of, I think that gives you a feeling of control over it. We don't always have 100% control over everything. We have to realize what we control and what we don't control. But I think if you read and understand and learn and expose yourself to a little bit to the things that you're afraid of, it will help you have more courage in life to do the things that will really make a difference.
It's good to understand that even someone like you, it has things that alarm you or can make you panic, because I think what we tend to think everybody else, certainly someone with your career and your background, that you're kind of immovable, fearless, but we all have something, and that's what makes us human.
The thing that I take away from that is it's amazing how the capacity of the human brain to invent fear in just any situations that we aren't used to. And we can be fearful of things that have no foundation in reality. And you've trained your brain to not be fearful of some incredibly precarious situations through your preparation and through your experience. And it just goes to show the capacity of what it takes to prepare for those kinds of situations. But the brain is eminently trainable. It's just when we come across the unexpected, it can be fearful. Well, speaking of things that are novel, the title of your book is Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars. So let's talk a little bit about how it was difficult to break that glass ceiling at NASA, and how you were novel to many people, and how you helped them overcome, their sense of, your capabilities and those of your fellow women.
Yeah, I would say, yes, I was the first woman to be a shuttle pilot and commander, but there were still other women before me that did other things. For example, there were several women mission specialists, Sally Ride's the most famous, that actually flew on the shuttle before me. Now, she took the brunt of the silly questions and, people asking her, how are you going to do your hair in space and what kind of clothes are you going to wear? And questions that the men didn't get asked. And Sally was really offended by that. She told me, actually, before my first mission, she called me on the phone and was talking a little bit about some of the things she had to deal with the press. And those things bothered her. She was very intelligent, and she wanted to talk about, why are we going to space? She was an arm operator. She was a robot arm operator, and she was doing experiments. So she really took the brunt of it. I took a little bit of it, but I think having Sally's, I want to say mentorship was a big help. There were also several women mission specialists in the astronaut office. They were doing fantastic work, as they are still today, and just very professional. They weren't out there like promoting themselves because they were women. They just didn't do that. And I didn't really, I honestly didn't do that myself. People came to me, but I didn't want to flaunt the fact, I'm the first woman, and try to make myself famous because of that. I wanted to be the best pilot I could be. So I think, to answer your question, for me, I took on that role as a challenge. You're going to be the first woman pilot. And this is when John Young, who was the Apollo 16 moonwalker, called me and told me I was hired and I would be the first woman. I took that on as a challenge, and I wanted to be the best I could be. So I studied probably twice as hard as I really needed to, tried to prepare for situations that honestly may never happen, but I wanted to be ready because I wanted to be the hero. I wanted to be the one that came in and saved everybody. AKA Star Trek or some of these science fiction movies that you see. I wanted to come in and be the hero, so I was preparing for that. And so I really think that I stand on the shoulders of the women that went. Oh, and I want to mention there were women flight controllers, and there were also women that went, they were called the Mercury 13. Way back in 1961, they went through the physical testing and mental testing. They proved that women have the ability to be astronauts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there were the women Air Force service pilots of World War II that flew airplanes. So I really think I stand on their shoulders. So knowing about them and actually working with some of them, I think really helped a lot. I think mentorship is important. And I like to tell people if you don't have a mentor, try to be a mentor to try to help someone. And I like to mentor men as well as women because I think it's important that we help everyone that is, maybe we see somebody that needs help. It's important that we reach out to them. I think the feeling I get mostly from your question is how happy I was to have the challenge to be the first woman pilot and commander of a space shuttle. I was actually very happy to have that challenge because I like to work hard. I like to really push the mission of space exploration because it's a mission I've always loved ever since as far back as I can remember. I love the mission. I wish we were farther into that mission. It's expensive. It's all I can. It's expensive to explore space, and I get disappointed when I see how slow it takes to get people like back to the moon and onto Mars. But I think that's what keeps me going even today, staying active as much as I can in the space business and helping promote that mission. So that's the challenge I love.
I'm going to take you a little bit back to leadership, talk about perhaps a little bit about your personal style. I know the word humility came up in conversations earlier, but you've talked a lot about training as well. Did you consciously train your leadership style? Is it something that kind of evolved as your career unfolded, or is it something you thought, right, now I'm trained as a leader?
So that is a very interesting question. I would say that when I joined the Air Force, we were given leadership training. It was not a choice. You didn't like, oh, I think I'll take a course in leadership. Everyone was given leadership training. And it was everything from reading about techniques of leadership and reading about great leaders to actually doing exercises where you would go out with your little group and they would give you a challenge and you'd have to figure it out. And they were mostly physical challenges. And you would watch how people in your group, some people would like to take over and some people would sit over there and they try to like figure out the answer. And some people were just completely out of it and you kind of felt bad for them. But you'd see all kinds. I never liked that leadership training because there would be conflict that would come out. There would be tough decisions. And you can imagine yourself out in the field. I'm sure many of your listeners have done these leadership training courses in the field. Even though I don't like them, I recommend doing them. It's something that's hard and uncomfortable, but it makes you better. And so we did a lot of those back in the military. I even went through survival training. In my book, I talk about how survival training, the challenge of that changed me, both the physical side as well. They had a POW camp and we were all like, quote, captured by the, quote, enemy. And we went through this prisoner of war. I say POW, it's prisoner of war training camp with the Air Force. So I had done all that training when I came to NASA. Now the civilians that come to NASA, they get sent to different leadership training courses. Like there's a cold weather survival. I could name a bunch of them. There's one in the Rocky Mountains. There's an underwater program down in the Florida Keys. It's not necessarily built for leadership training, but you still get leadership training from some of these. And they're really good. You learn about yourself. You will do things in these leadership. I say you will. I surprised myself because I did things I didn't expect that I would do. So once I came to NASA, I felt like I had my leadership style established, but not totally true. I was more of an autocratic type leader in the military because I thought that's what they wanted. And I would tell people, oh, you should do this or you should do that. Honestly, I don't think that works. It definitely did not work at NASA. But back in my later years in the Air Force, I learned that I needed to be more of a collaborative type leader. So my leadership style changed when I'm going to say in my early 30s, if I finally came around that, Eileen, you don't have to know it all. You really have to know your people and know which people to put in which roles That's a very difficult thing to do, at least for me. So one of the things a leader has to do is know their people enough to say, you need to be in this position, this job, you need to be over here, and put the right people in the right places. And then give them the authority to do their job. Don't micromanage them. And I had to learn that because I was a micromanager and I was more of an autocrat, and I had to stop doing that. And I think being at NASA, working with people that really knew what they were doing, highly motivated, intelligent, I was able, once I became a shuttle commander, was to, like tell my crew, okay, you're in charge of deploying the telescope. You're in charge of logistics. You're in charge of this system, whether it's on the payload or on the shuttle, and let them do their job. And I think I finally learned that after making mistakes throughout my career. I had a student way back when I was in my 20s, I had a student tell me, ma'am, could you not talk to me so much in the airplane? And I went, oh, I didn't realize I was talking to you that much. I said, okay, well, let's do that. I'll stop talking and let you, apparently my talking was interfering with his thinking. So I started talking less. And once I became a shuttle commander, I remember one of my crewmates, Wendy Lawrence, was in charge of all the logistics transfer to the space station and back. And at that point in my life, I had matured to the point, I said to Wendy, you're in charge of the logistics. I'm not going to tell you what to do. If you have a problem, come to me and I'll help you solve your problem. Please just keep me up to speed on what you're doing and make sure we talk to each other. And I let her do her job. I left her alone and she did a great job. And so I think through a series of mistakes, I talk a little bit about them in my book. I think I became the right leader for the particular position that I was in. I wasn't perfect. I look back and I think there were other things I would do differently. But I think I was the right leader for that last mission that I flew, because we can probably get into this later. I felt it was my job to keep people working together. I didn't want conflict to develop. I wanted people, if it did develop, I wanted to help make sure that they worked together, that they didn't work against each other.
And that's where I want to dig in a little bit. I mean, how do you think about in a situation where, one small thing can become a really big thing in the context of a space mission? So if I'm trying to think about how I would deal with analogous situations if I were a leader, and you talked about trying not to micromanage your team. And this is a situation that I could imagine that lots of leaders would say, well, I need to micromanage this because anything that goes wrong could be disastrous. And so, how do you build up a sense of trust that someone is going to be sufficiently detail oriented, and what you're managing is that person's attention to detail rather than, the individual tasks themselves? So how do you, I find it kind of interesting that you're focused on the way the team is working together rather than the outcomes in how you're describing it. So tell us a little bit about that orientation and how you trained yourself on that front.
Well, outcome is important. Outcome is very important. And I think, to me, I see that as mission. We had a mission, obviously, but the mission was broke down into about 12 main objectives. And as the commander, I had to make sure that I was ultimately responsible, along with my flight director. He's on the ground, but I'm ultimately responsible up in space, that those specific number of objectives are completed. And they're listed in order of preference. So if there's ever a conflict, the solution goes to what is the higher priority. Which, by the way, is one of the techniques I use to resolve conflict is, which is the higher priority. I would say the best training to be a shuttle commander, this was a joke. I used to say this when I command my second and last mission. The best training to be a shuttle commander is to be a parent, because you started your question with the little things, conflict can build over little things that ultimately are not important. And if you're married, you know exactly what I'm talking about because you see married couples like go at it over something that is not important at all. And it's like, who cares? And I think it ends up like being a little power struggle. And I see this over in my family. I just see this over and over again. And I would say what you're arguing about or what your conflict is about, where is that in the order of priority? If it's where are we going to go eat tonight? I don't really care. That's not important. Or, what color is my shirt going to be? I don't, because we do actually have to make those decisions. What color shirt am I going to wear in space? Like on the day that we do the crew picture, what shirt are we going to wear? We get a crew picture taken. And what are we going to put in there? We have a patch. How do we design the patch? These are things the crews work together on. But ultimately, those are nice things. And we need to have them. But we don't want conflict to develop over them. We certainly don't want conflict to develop over a mission objective. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but I will say it was important to me as commander to know what are I'm going to say what was the number one objective, like strategic objective of our flight. The last one was to get the shuttle flying again safely after the Columbia accident. Everything that I did, I came back to that number one objective: get the shuttle flying safely again after the Columbia accident. And then we had it broken down into objectives. And it was everything from resupplying the space station to making sure that we did an exterior survey of the shuttle. And I'm not going to get into too much detail, but that was one of the causes of the Columbia accident, was a breach in the heat shield. So do an external survey. We had to be able to repair certain types of damage that might have happened to our heat shield. We had to safely rendezvous and dock with the space station, transfer 5,000 pounds of logistics. If whatever conflict we were having didn't deal with those main objectives, it was like, okay, make a decision right now and get it over with and put it behind us, because we need to stay focused on the important parts of this mission. And I found myself doing a lot of that as commander, and keeping my crew, and my crew was great, by the way. They were wonderful, but you want to keep everybody, because, even I was getting lost on, okay, so what are we going to do when we go out with our, somebody on some social event? Let's just do it. It doesn't matter. Let's not let conflict develop about it. Let's do those things, but don't let conflict break down crew cohesiveness. I would say the biggest thing that was causing conflict was how much money was available for this mission. We didn't have money to do everything. We had to decide, for example, repair techniques. There must have been dozens of repair techniques to repair a space shuttle heat shield during a space walk. You couldn't possibly fund all of them. So as we went along, some of them had to be down selected. Can't do that anymore. It's being down selected. But then you had to get those people, those engineers on board, like, hey, we loved your idea. It was great. We just didn't have the money to do everything. So now I need you to get on board with this other idea and work with them. And sometimes that's really hard to do. And I think because people take it personally when their little project is not going to fly. So get them on board with another team, work together. And it's amazing how people get like really personally and emotionally involved in what they're doing in their work. And that can be something really difficult. And I found that's where it's important for a commander to make the effort to talk to the people individually and keep them motivated as part of the mission, even though their assigned project was not selected. I just use that as an example. Keep in mind that last mission I flew was after an accident where 7 people lost their lives. So their emotions were very high. And I ended up finding myself in a role where I was calming people down and helping them get refocused on getting the shuttle flying again.
You're talking about mission, and I've heard you say in the past that you had your own sort of personal mission, not to be the first woman to shoot, but to be the best pilot you could possibly be. And when we talk about mission in that kind of context, we use the word, in business these days, we use the word purpose a lot. I'm not sure whether there is a difference between them, but how important is it to define what we're trying to do in terms of a higher calling, so that you can do that very process you've been describing, where you've got something higher to appeal to, which should and can obviously diffuse potential conflict?
Yeah, well, the higher calling is space exploration, getting people off planet Earth into space, living and working on space stations, returning to the moon, building research stations on the moon, learning how to live and work on another planetary body like the moon, and eventually sending people to Mars, planet Mars, which is much farther. I mean, the moon you can get there in 3 days with, I would say, conventional propulsion, chemical propulsion, like just your normal rocket engines, 3 days to get to the moon. But it's 6 months to get to Mars. Sometimes it takes 2 years, depending on, planets move around. So sometimes it takes 2 years to get to Mars. We need to, I would say, develop the equipment that will keep the astronauts alive while we're on the surface of the moon and get that to be very reliable equipment. I'm talking water recycling, carbon dioxide recycling, just life support systems. Get them working. And you got the moon, it has dust, it has no atmosphere, it's got radiation, it's got all of these threats to your life. But we've got to get those working on the moon well enough so eventually when we go to Mars, we have a failure on, you don't want to have a failure on Mars because you're so far away. And, it takes so much longer to get back or to send equipment. So that would be, I would say, the higher calling. And, back to just want to say one other thing about leadership styles, to touch on one thing you asked. What I learned in the military, 3 elements of leadership that are like the basis for everything else. The first is knowledge of your job. Just knowing, you don't need to know everything, but you need to know what is the mission. You need to understand the mission. The second one is people. I mentioned earlier, getting the right people in the right places and always communicating. And the third is integrity. And that is a whole nother subject. We think integrity is honesty, which it is honesty, but it's also trusting that the person will be honest with you in the future. There has to be that element of trust in leadership. And that's something that takes time to develop. And those techniques I talked about earlier. So those 3 things I learned as a second lieutenant in the military a long time ago. I never forgot them because they worked. Now there's more. That's not everything, but to me, that's the foundation. Knowing your job, knowing your people, and having a sense of integrity.
Eileen, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think we are unfortunately out of time in our podcast, but we would love to continue to have you develop lessons, and we'll make sure to share when the documentary is released and link to the book. Last very quick question. Who else, do you admire and should we have on this podcast? Who would you recommend that we speak to?
What first comes to mind is one of the Apollo astronauts. Now, there were 12 men that walked on the moon. Only 4 of them are still alive. And 2 of them are pretty active. One is Harrison Schmitt. He was a senator after he left NASA, but he's a geologist, and he walked on the moon on Apollo 17. I think if you could get one of those 4, or even Jerry Griffin, who's still active, he was a flight director during Apollo. I would recommend a book called Apollo Race to the Moon. And although it talks about how the Apollo program happened, it helps you realize how to do difficult missions. And I would say any of those Apollo flight directors or astronauts, their availability, it's very hard to get on their schedule.
We're very, very fortunate and very grateful for getting you. So thank you so much. But that's all we have time for. Huge thanks to our guest, to Eileen Collins, and to you all for listening. This is the Provocateurs podcast. We've been Des Dearlove and Steve Goldbach. Please do join us again soon for another episode of Provocateurs. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and share with your friends and colleagues. And we'll see you next time.
This podcast is part of an ongoing series of interviews with executives. The executives' participation in this podcast are solely for educational purposes based on their knowledge of the subject, and the views expressed by them are solely their own. Podcasts should not be deemed or construed to be for the purpose of soliciting business for any of the companies mentioned, nor does Deloitte advocate or endorse the services or products provided by these companies.